Yes, today let us turn our attention to war poets or the poets of the First World War. The poets of the First World War. When I did Georgian poetry, I emphatically told you that among the Georgian poets, there were a group of poets which were known as war poets or poets of the First World War. See, the Great War of 1914 to 1918, that is the First World War. The Great War of 1914 to 1918 exercised considerable influence on the poetry of the Georgian period. Yes, of course, it is a fact that the Great War which raged between 1914 and 1918 gave considerable influence. Considerable means very large influence on poetry of the Georgian period. See, war poetry consists of two groups. War poets or war poetry consists of or includes or comprises of two groups. The first one is laudatory verses of the older poets who stayed at home. The first group is that of laudatory verses. Laudatory means praising poems. Those poems who praised or glorified war. Laudatory verses of the older poets who stayed at home, who never participated in the World War. They never participated in the World War except one poet. The only one poet who participated in the World War and who glorified the war was Rupert Brooke. Other poets were stay-at-homes. They stayed at home but glorified war. They pointed out that war was something which brought out the best in human beings. And the second group was the cynical poems of. The second kind of poetry is the cynical poems of their young counterparts, young poets who had been to the forefront and witnessed the horrors of warfare. They were the poets who had actually gone to the World War and vehemently participated in it and who had been the forefront of war, and therefore they had the opportunity of witnessing the horrors of warfare. The second group is the cynical poems of their young counterparts who had been to the forefront of war and had witnessed the horrors of warfare. There were poets who glorified war without participating in the war. And there were poets who looked upon war as a great tragedy. There were poets who considered the tragic elements of war. They considered war as a great tragedy. So these were the two groups of poetry, war poetry, or these were the two categories of war poets. Rudyard Kipling, John Freeman, Thomas Hardy, the novelist cum poet, Robert Bridges, Rupert Brooke, he was a young poet who participated in the war. Then John Masefield and Lawrence Binion are the poets who sang the glories of war, who belonged to the first group of war poets who glorified wars, who were the poets that glorified or brought out the best of the war, who brought out the patriotism, nobility and heroic elements of war. They were Rudyard Kipling, John Freeman, Thomas Hardy, that you already know, Robert Bridges, Rupert Brooke, John Masefield and Lawrence Binion are the poets who sang the glories of war. patriotism sacrifice and victory were their themes. They glorified the war and also they glorified patriotism. They extolled sacrifice and they praised the victory in the war. Rudyard Kipling has the pride of place among these poets. The most important place among the poets who glorified war goes to Rudyard Kipling. Rudyard Kipling occupies the prominent place among the war poets who glorified war, sacrifice, patriotism and victory. Rudyard Kipling exhorted his countrymen to be patriotic. He wanted his countrymen, Englishmen, to be patriotic and to hail war enthusiastically. He also wanted people to hail. Hail means greet. War enthusiastically means with great enthusiasm. He asked the people of England to hail, to greet the war in an enthusiastic manner or enthusiastically. Freeman, John Freeman, struck the note of optimism and hope. Freeman struck. He pointed out the note of optimism and hope in war. The two elements that he pointed out in war were optimism and hope. Freeman struck the note of optimism and hope in war. Binion, which Binion? Lawrence Binion. Hardy, Thomas Hardy. Masefield, John Masefield. And Bridges, which Bridges? Robert Bridges. Examined the future prospects of war. These poets, which poets? The poets who stayed at home and glorified the war. Among them, Binion, Lawrence Binion, Thomas Hardy, John Masefield, and Robert Bridges examined the future prospects of war, the future importance of war. And it was the young soldier poets. Among them, I earlier told you there is only one poet who actually partook in the war. Only one poet who actually participated in the war. That is none other than Rupert Brooke. It was the young soldier poet Rupert Brooke who gave a romantic and idealized vision of war. The poet who gave a romantic and idealized vision of war was Rupert Brooke, the young soldier poet. So it was the young soldier poet Rupert Brooke who gave a romantic and idealized vision of war. Rupert Brooke, his period was between 1887 and 1915. 1887-1915. He glorified patriotism through his poems and sonnets. He glorified patriotism. His collected poems, a publication, collected poems, caught the mood of the romantic patriotism of the early war period. So his collected poems caught the mood of the romantic patriotism of the early war period or early war years. His sonnets. What is sonnet? Sonnet is a 14-lined poem. His sonnet his sonnets glorify war as a great adventure. You know, the sonnets written by Rupert Brooke glorify war as a great heroic adventure. He welcomed the call to action with great joy. He was always fond of war and warfare, and he welcomed wholeheartedly the call to action, call to war with great joy. He welcomed the call to action with great joy. The soldier, a sonnet. The soldier, his finest war sonnet, extols, praises, glorifies the virtue of patriotism. What does the poem extol? What does the poem, the soldier, or the sonnet extol? The finest sonnet by Rupert Brooke, the soldier, extols the virtue of patriotism. The soldier, his finest war sonnet, extols the virtue of patriotism. And among other poets who who had a cynical view about the war. The other poets who had a cynical view about the war, or who found the pity and horror of war, are Siegfried Sassoon, Siegfried Sassoon, Siegfried Sassoon, Robert Graves, Wilfred Owen, a well-known poet, Isaac Rosenberg, and Edmund Blunden. Some of these names we found when we studied Georgian poetry. Once again, the names Siegfried Sassoon, Robert Graves, Wilfred Owen, Isaac Rosenberg, and Edmund Blunden are the poets who wrote from within. From within means within the war. They never stayed at home. They were not stay-at-homes. They participated and actively partook in the war. So they had a first-hand experience of the horror and terror of the war. So these poets wrote from within, that is from the forefront of the war. In their poems we can see the ravages. In the poems by these poets we can see the ravages and horrors of war depicted clearly. All these poets have depicted very clearly the horrors and ravages of the war. So these are another category of war poets who found the horror and pity of war. Siegfried Sassoon is the first soldier poet. He is the very first soldier poet to reveal the ghastly, horrible and terrible realities of war. The very first poet to reveal the ghastly and terrible realities of war through the poems was Siegfried Sassoon. He is the first soldier poet to reveal the ghastly and terrible realities of war. Sassoon served as an officer in the early years of war. This poet Siegfried Sassoon served in the military as an officer in the early times of the First World War. His Counterattack, a poem by him, Counterattack, expresses Counterattack. It was published in the year 1918, the year in which war came to an end. The First World War ended, 1918. His Counteraction, which was published in 1918, expresses in embittered words, in angry words, in embittered words, in indignant words, in indignant poem. It is an indignant poem against war. In embittered, angry words, the horrors of life and death in the trenches. He very clearly depicts through the poem Counteraction, which was published in 1918, the very horrors of life and death in the trenches in the warfare, in the war front, and in the hospitals. The case of the wounded and dying soldiers in the hospitals. D.N.N.Litt, a famous critic, D.N.N.Litt says that Sassoon's most interesting poetry, Siegfried Sassoon's most interesting, most well-known poetry is composed on what have been called the negative emotions. That is the opinion of the famous critic D.N.N.Litt. According to D.N.N.Litt, Sassoon's most interesting poetry is composed on what have been called the negative emotions such as horror, anger, disgust, etc. Then Robert Graves too was horrified by the devastation of war. He was also very much horrified by the great destruction caused by the war. Robert Graves too was horrified by, he was also frightened by the devastation, the great destruction, large scale destruction created or caused by war. He was horrified by the devastation of war. Then Wilfred Owen. We come to the war poet who showed the pity and horror of war, Wilfred Owen. His period was between 1893 and 1918, the year in which war came to an end. 1893 and 1918, he died in action in the First World War. That is why he died in the year in which the First World War came to an end. He died in action. He died while fighting. Wilfred Owen, 1893, 1918, is the greatest of war poets. Undoubtedly, we can say that the greatest of war poets is Wilfred Owen. With a frank realism, Owen depicted the grim reality of war. With a frank, open realism, Owen depicted the grim reality of war. He wrote, I am quoting his words. So this is a quote by Wilfred Owen. I am not concerned with the poetry. I am not concerned with the dictum, versification, prosody, etc., meter, rhythm of the poetry. My subject is war. I am not concerned with poetry. My subject is war and the pity of war. The poetry is pity. My poetry is pity, means his poetry is an example of the pity caused by war. His poetry is pity. This is the famous quote by Wilfred Owen, the greatest of the war. Edmund Blunden could not present the ugliness of war with the same vigor and force as his fellow poets. Edmund Blunden was not able to present the ugliness, pity, horror of war with the same vigor and vitality as his fellow poets. He never equaled his fellow poets in depicting the horror, pity, and devastation, ravages of war. If Owen and Isaac Rosenberg had survived the war, so they were the war poets who died in action. Wilfred Owen and Rosenberg, Isaac Rosenberg and Wilfred Owen. So they were the war poets who participated in the war and died in action. So if they had survived the war, if they were able to live even after the war, modernism would have taken a different turn. Of course, modernism would have been a different turn. The modernism would have taken a different turn if Wilfred Owen and Rosenberg had survived the First World War. So this is about the war poets. Study these things in your examination, university examination. You may be asked to write a note on war poets. So that is a very frequent question, a note on war poets. So study all these things with great attention and diligence. Okay?